This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we go now to New York Democratic Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez questioning Michael Cohen at yesterday's House hearing.
My colleague from Vermont had asked you several questions about AMI, the parent company of the National Enquirer. And in that, you mentioned a treasure trove, a quote, treasure trove of documents in David Pecker's office relating to information assembled from all these catch and kill operations against people who potentially had damaging information on the president. You also mentioned that the president was very concerned about the whereabouts of these documents and who possessed them. Does that treasure trove of documents still exist?
I don't know. I had asked David Pecker for them.
So you would say the person who knows the whereabouts of these documents would be David Pecker?
David Pecker, Barry Levine, or Dylan Howard.
Okay, thank you. Secondly, I want to ask a little bit about your conversation with my colleague from Missouri about asset inflation. To your knowledge, did the president ever provide inflated assets to an insurance company?
Yes.
Who else knows that the president did this?
Alan Weisselberg, Ron Lieberman, and Matthew Calamari.
And where would the committee find more information on this? Do you think we need to review his financial statements and his tax returns in order to compare them?
Yes, and you'd find it at the Trump org.
Mr. Cohen, I want to ask you about your assertion that the president may have improperly devalued his assets to avoid paying taxes. According to an August 21st, 2016 report by the Washington Post, while the president claimed in financial disclosure forms that Trump National Golf Club in Jupiter, Florida, was worth more than $50 million, he had reported otherwise to local tax authorities that the course was worth, quote, no more than $5 million. Mr. Cohen, do you know whether this specific report is accurate?
It's identical to what he did at Trump National Golf Club at Briarcliff Manor.
Do you know, to your knowledge, was the president interested in reducing his local real estate bills, tax bills?
Yes.
And how did he do that?
What you do is you deflate the value of the asset, and then you put in a request to the tax department for a deduction.
Thank you. Now, in October 2018, the New York Times revealed that, quote, President Trump participated in dubious tax schemes during the 1990s, including instances of outright fraud that greatly increased the fortune he received from his parents. It further stated from Mr. Trump, quote, he also helped formulate a strategy to undervalue his parents' real estate holdings by hundreds of millions of dollars on tax returns, sharply reducing his tax bill when those properties were transferred to him and his siblings. Mr. Cohen, do you know whether that specific report is accurate?
I don't. I wasn't there in 1990s.
Who would know the answer to those questions?
Alan Weisselberg.
And would it help for the committee to obtain federal and state tax returns from the president and his company to address that discrepancy?
I believe so.
So that's New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez questioning Michael Cohen. The significance of what she was asking, Marcy Wheeler.
Well, it's one of those examples that I talked about where there's evidence of other kinds of criminal activity that didn't make the headline, didn't make Michael Cohen's opening statement. And in this case, AOC kind of laid the groundwork for this committee or any other congressional committees to get his tax returns, to get the tax records from these golf courses, to get, to pull in AMI, National Enquirer, to ask whether there's compromising information that they've held out over Donald Trump. And so in 5 minutes, this freshman congresswoman just laid out a whole investigative plan for 3 more topics into Donald Trump's potentially criminal activities.
And this issue of the treasure trove and the safe over at National Enquirer, at AMI, the parent company, what is in this, and David Pecker's knowledge about what exactly Trump was concerned about and who has this treasure trove right now?
Right. The term is catch and kill. So for years, anytime some embarrassing or scandalous story would sort of float out there about Donald Trump's conduct, National Enquirer would hear about it or often get offered the story, and then they would get the person's story rights, pay for them, and basically kill the story. And they had done that with a couple of the accusations of affairs, but we would assume that the stories are similar kinds of things, accusations of affairs. There was the love child story that was one of those. And
that he said was false. Those
stories would of Trump potentially fathering a child with one of the staffers. That
Michael Cohen said
building.
They said was false.
Right. He said he never found that story. Those are the kinds of stories, though.
But they
that
paid $15,000 to kill it anyway.
Right. Right. Sure. It was the election season, and a lot of people have noted that one wasn't named in his charging documents as one of the hush money stories. But nevertheless, there's all these stories. National Enquirer's been doing this for years, and it is a legitimate story about where those stories currently are, where they legally are, and whether National Enquirer has any kind of leverage over the president because they've got all his secrets.
You know, race was an undercurrent of this whole hearing. You had, of course, Michael Cohen starting off by calling President Trump a racist. I want to turn to North Carolina Republican Congressmember Mark Meadows, who heads up the Freedom Caucus, who introduced Department of Housing and Urban Development appointee Lynn Patton, an African-American woman, in an attempt to disprove Cohen's claims that Donald Trump is a racist.
Mr. Cohen, do you know Lynn Patton? I'm right here.
Oh, yes, sir.
Do you know Lynn Patton?
Yes, I do.
I asked Lynn to come today in her personal capacity to actually shed some light. How long have you known Ms. Patton?
I'm responsible for Lynn Patton joining the Trump Organization and the job that she currently holds.
Well, I'm glad you acknowledged that, because you made some very demeaning comments about the president that Ms. Patton doesn't agree with. In fact, it has to do with your claim of racism. She says that as a daughter of a man born in Birmingham, Alabama, that there is no way that she would work for an individual who was racist. How do you reconcile the two of those, Mr.
As neither should I, as the son of a Holocaust survivor.
But, Mr. Cohen, I guess what I'm saying is I've talked to the president over 300 times. I've not heard one time a racist comment out of his mouth in private. So how do you reconcile it? Do you have proof of those conversations?
Well, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of Michigan later responded to Congressman Meadows.
Just to make a note, Mr. Chairman, just because someone has a person of color, a black person working for them, does not mean they aren't racist. And it is insensitive that some would even say it's the fact that someone would actually use a prop, a black woman, in this chamber, in this committee, is alone racist in itself.
Well, since yesterday's hearing, a video has resurfaced of North Carolina Republican Congressmember Mark Meadows making a racist joke about President Obama in 2012.
Good to be here with you today. I thank you so much for allowing me just a few minutes to talk with you and share a few things. But, you know, it's interesting when the more we find out, the more we realize how wrong the direction we're going. And so what we're going to do is take back our country. 2012 is the time that we're going to send Mr. Obama home to Kenya or wherever it is. We're going to do it.
Send Obama home to Kenya or wherever it is. Marcy Wheeler.
Right, and there was a big to-do at the end of the hearing about whether or not Congresswoman Tlaib had stepped over bounds, over congressional rules on insulting a colleague. But right, I mean,
and Elijah
Mark
Cummings
Meadows
said something very interesting, who is the chair of the House Oversight Committee. He said, people may not know, but Mark Meadows is, he said, actually my best friend.
That was one of the craziest pieces of news out of the entire hearing, I admit. I think people are puzzling through that. And another thing that Meadows did at the end of the hearing was Cummings had said, hold off on submitting all these articles until we're done. There were just a few members of Congress left. One was AOC, one was Congresswoman Presley, and one was Congresswoman Tlaib. And so you had three women of color waiting for their turns, having waited all day. And Mark Meadows didn't follow Cummings's request and basically tried to stall Tlaib just minutes before she said that was a racist act. And then he, threw a tissy fit.
And it was amazing. Ayanna Pressley called out the racism, the freshman congresswoman, first African-American congresswoman to represent Massachusetts. You had Brenda Lawrence, also of Detroit and Michigan, talking about the racism of President Trump.
Right, and Cohen said one of the reasons he started thinking differently about Trump was Charlottesville. So, and I think his response was right on. I think Meadows that was an example where Meadows and the president's defenders really didn't expect Cohen to be as sharp as he was. But yeah, he is the child of a Holocaust survivor, and that too should make it beyond the pale, beyond common rationality to work for Trump for so many years while he coddled these racists.
I want to go to...
I don't think any... Go ahead.
I want to go to Representative Ro Khanna of California questioning Michael Cohen about a check payment he received from the Trump Revocable Trust.
As federal prosecutors laid out in their criminal charges, payments like this check resulted in numerous false statements in the books and records of the Trump Organization. And it's important for the American public to understand this. Nothing to do with collusion. This is financial fraud, garden variety financial fraud. It was disguised as a payment for legal services to you. But this was not a payment for legal services, was it, Mr. Cohen?
No, sir.
You told Representative Kelly that the president was aware of this scheme. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I just want the American public to understand the explosive nature of your testimony in this document. Are you telling us, Mr. Cohen, that the president directed transactions in conspiracy with Alan Weisselberg and his son, Donald Trump Jr., as part of a criminal conspiracy of financial fraud? Is that your testimony today?
Yes.
I also want to go to an exchange between Michael Cohen and California Democrat Harley Ruda.
Over the years, President Trump was asked how many times he interacted with convicted Russian mobster Felix Sater. In 2013, President Trump testified that, quote, "Not many. If he were sitting in the room right now, I really wouldn't know what he looked like," unquote. Mr. Cohen, as you previously testified, isn't it true that President Trump knew convicted Russian mobster Felix Sater in 2013 when he made that statement?
Yes.
Isn't it true that because of Mr. Sater's relationship to the Trump Organization, that he had an office in the Trump Tower?
And on the 26th floor, Mr. Trump.
And the 26th floor is important. Why?
Because it's Mr. Trump's floor.
So he had an office on the same floor as President Trump.
In fact, his office, when he left, became my office.
And isn't it also true that convicted Russian mobster Sater even had business cards indicating that he was a senior advisor to Donald Trump, as reported by the Washington Post?
Yes.
Did convicted Russian mobster Sater pay rent for his office?
No, he did not.
So, based on those facts, isn't it true that President Trump misled at best, or worse, lied under oath?
Yes.
Harley Ruda questioning Michael Cohen. 10 seconds. Marcy Wheeler, the significance of this.
Sater was the guy who was brokering the Trump Tower deal all through the election, and Trump made similar comments during the election about not knowing Felix Sater, when, in fact, he was negotiating a $300 million real estate deal through Sater to Russians.
Finally, Elijah Cummings at the end of the hearing.
I believe that the president committed a crime while in office.
Based on what, looking at the checks and listening to Mr. Cohen, it appears that he did.
It appears that he committed a crime, said the House Committee Chair, Elijah Cummings. That does it for our coverage today. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.